But I think a whiskey that's really underrated is, so I've had to think about this a lot. This is a great question. I think the most overrated distillery is straight off to a hot take question. I don't know, is it really that great? So you guys have asked me so many juicy questions about whiskey, so I thought it's time for a Q&A. I'm Phil, and I'm gonna fill you in about what you want to know about whiskey. So I'm not going to answer every single question because, I mean, this will be like a 2-hour video, but I will answer a lot of them. Okay, so the first question comes from Michael, and he said, what are 5 Scotch whiskies that you dislike and are not for you? So straight off to a hot take question, just to get out of the way. Obviously, this is going to be all personal preference. Whiskey is very subjective. The first one on the list that kind of came to mind when I was thinking about this question is the Loch Lomond 18. And I was really surprised about this and kind of gutted that I didn't like it so much because it's got a lot of good stuff going for it. It's unchill filtered and it's an 18-year-old. I don't have many 18-year-olds, and this was like an affordable 18-year-old. The owners also own Glen Scotia, and I absolutely love Glen Scotia, but there's just something about the taste for this whiskey that I didn't like. There's sort of like this farmy note, just wasn't for me. The next one on the list was the Paul John Brilliance 46%. This is a weird whiskey. Obviously, all the stats are there again, 46% unchill filter, natural color, but just because the stats are there doesn't make it a good whiskey. This is a really weird one because it's the whiskey that Jim Murray rated like his top whiskey of the year one year. And I just do not see that at all. It's got this weird kind of vivid note I don't like. Next whiskey I don't actually have in my collection, that was the Talisker Sky. And I also didn't like the Jura Superstition. When I was first getting into whiskey, I really liked the Jura 10. Great whiskey for beginners, so I got the Jura Superstition, and it just had this weird like burnt cigarette kind of note. I just couldn't get behind it. So the next question comes from David Owen, and he said, hi Phil, we'd just like to ask what your favorite cask matured whiskey is. Bourbon matured, sherry, both, or something different? This is a great question. As you know, I've done a video on sherried whiskey, I've done a video on peated whiskey, and hopefully I'll do a video soon on ex-bourbon whiskey and all that sort of thing. But where do I sit? What's actually my personal favorite? Well, I think it's actually when it's a really nice blend by the distillery where they've mixed ex-bourbon cask with ex-sherry cask. Good example of this is Longmorn 16. Another great example is the Belblair 15. I'm just loving this whiskey at the moment. It's just that perfect sweet spot of sherry and ex-bourbon. Next question comes from the Whiskey Guide. Hey, love your videos. Thanks, man. What are your thoughts on Japanese whiskey as a whole? And if you haven't tried many, is it a category you consider exploring in future? So I have explored Japanese whiskey. It was a lot easier to explore a few years ago. I actually went to Japan. I got this bottle. Got it for a good price in Japan. So if you're in Japan, you probably get better prices than the rest of the world. It's a fascinating kind of story, Japanese whiskey. Basically what happened in the 80s, whiskey kind of went out of fashion. People were drinking kind of white spirits and vodka and that sort of thing. So what happened is a lot of production was reduced, especially in Japan, where there were kind of only really 2 main companies making whiskey. Got to the late 90s, early 2000s, and then Japanese whiskey got really popular, took off. I think it won some awards and that sort of thing. So it was just a supply and demand thing. Prices went way up, supply went way down, and then we started losing age statements of Japanese whiskey, like this Yoichi has no age statement, and it's just really expensive for what it is compared to other types of whiskey. But what's interesting, the Japanese whiskey industry has put millions and millions of dollars into, production, that sort of thing. So I think like 5 years from now, we might see a resurgence of age-stated, good value Japanese whiskey. But at the moment, it's just not really great value for money for me. But if you do want to go deeper into this question, I definitely think you should head over to Kanpai Planet.
Welcome to Kanpai Planet, bringing you the world of Japan's drinks direct from the heart of Tokyo.
Knows heaps about Japanese whiskey and that sort of thing. Very knowledgeable. In fact, here's a video on your exact question, and I'll link it down in the description. This question comes from Instagram. It says, what budget whiskey do you not mind drinking from time to time? So obviously there's like the really budget whiskeys like a Jack Daniels or like a Jameson, and I actually own some of those because they're great for cocktails. They're great for like drying limes and that sort of thing. But in terms of like a budget whiskey that I would actually sip on, the first one that comes to mind is the Glenkinchie 12. Really like this. Always a great price in New Zealand. So I've had a couple of questions about bourbon, what I feel about it. Do I own any bourbon and that sort of thing? This is an interesting question because in the States, bourbon producers have such a massive local market that they don't really need to rely on exporting great bourbons out to like New Zealand. Whereas Scotland has the population of like New Zealand, a much larger percentage of their income comes from the export market outside of Scotland. So that's why in New Zealand, we get some really nice scotches, and we get some really average bourbons. You know, obviously there's the big giant multinational companies like Jim Beam and Jack Daniels that we get, and you know, it's quite easy to get those. But in terms of like those real unique ones you see on bourbon channels, it's just not that much. Also as well, in terms of my palate, I just find bourbon a little bit more sweet than Scotch, which is not really my palate. I prefer kind of more dry flavors. But I do have a couple of bourbons that I do like, and one here is the Wild Turkey Rare Breed Barrel Proof, really nice whiskey, and another one is the Elijah Craig Barrel Proof. Great whiskey, but very, very expensive, and to be honest, when I finish this, I don't know if I'll buy another. Jared on Instagram said, what are your top 2 overrated whiskies and your top 2 underrated? Great question. In terms of Scotch, I think overall, kind of outside of whiskey geek niche circles and just overall, I think the most overrated distillery is Macallan. It's the one that billionaires have on their super yachts. There's just a lot of hype around it.
50-year-old Macallan. A particular favorite of yours, I understand.
But some of those bottles just go for such ridiculous amounts of money, and they like bottled at 40% and this sort of thing. The most overrated for bourbon, I'd say, would be the Blantons. I know it's got the cool little horse on it and that sort of thing. But I don't know, is it really that great for, you know, people line up for it now and that sort of thing, and they, you know, it's really hard to find. Underrated was kind of a harder question. I think there's quite a few whiskies you could say were underrated. The 2 that came to my mind was the Anok 18, fantastic whiskey, especially for an 18-year-old, good value. But I think a whiskey that's really underrated is this one here, the Speyburn 15. Okay, next question comes from Brian on Instagram. He said, 3 whiskey personalities, dead or alive, a dinner table with you, who would they be? This is a fantastic question. I'd love to know your answers to this question as well down in the comments. So I've had to think about this a lot. This is, oh, there's a few that I would like to, you know, chat to. But yeah, I came down to 3. Charles McLean, I think he'd be a fascinating person to talk to about all things whiskey. Daniel Whittington from the Whiskey Tribe and Whiskey Vault, he'd just be fun to hang out with. And Jim McEwen, who used to own British Laddie and some other distilleries, and he just seems like such an interesting character. So someone actually asked a couple more questions. He said, what inspired you to make the channel and how long do you spend on each video? Basically, what inspired me to make the channel was I just found it quite difficult when I was getting into whiskey to get the basics sort of down. There's just a lot of complicated, it was almost like a fire hose of information straight away, and I just wanted the basics, and I come from a video background, so I just wanted to make some sort of like, you know, what is a single malt, what are the whiskey regions, what whiskey glass should I use, just basic questions to help people on their journey of getting into whiskey, because, you know, that's what I felt like at the time I couldn't find, but I think it's a bit different now. Like there's a lot more other channels on YouTube now. Just a side note, I got a couple of questions about like stills and distillation and what are copper stills and coffee stills and that sort of thing. Because a few of you have been asking this, my next kind of explainer video I hope can be this one, all about stills. You know, what is that about? So look out for that. Subscribe, hit the like button, hit the bell if you're interested in like, you know, really in-depth explaining, because I feel like I've spent like an hour answering this question. Next question was, is there any good Australian whiskey to try? Well, Tasmania seems to be where it's at when I talk to people in Australia. There's some really great whiskies out there. I've heard McHenry's really good. I really want to go there and actually do a tour. I'd love to do a video of Tasmanian whiskey. It's definitely one on the list. Okay, next question. Kia ora. What New Zealand whiskey are you enjoying at the moment? Definitely this one. Loving out Waiheke Moss. It's a New Zealand peated whiskey I talked about in my peated whiskey video, and started releasing full bottles, and it's fantastic. It's just a different take on peated whiskey. It's just so different to Isla whiskey. Okay, so the next question was, if I just had one bottle for the rest of my life, which bottle would it be? I'm guessing that you still have to pay for this bottle, so it would have to be the Glencairn 10 for me. I love this whiskey. It goes in so many different moods. It's complex. I'm a big fan of today's sponsor, which is Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes made for people who want to invest in themselves, enabling them to discover their own creativity with whatever they want to do. There's a course that I really liked, which was called Cocktail Secrets, Making Your Own Signature Drink. There's a massive variety of other new classes to discover, like how to be a beer geek, or leadership, or marketing, or maybe just how to make your own logo. There's definitely a course out there that will add add value to you and match your goals. And the depth of these classes is unreal. It's all kind of split up into like easy to consume chapters which you can watch on your laptop or your phone. And it's ad-free too, and everything's subtitled in Spanish, French, Portuguese, and German. So if you want to try Skillshare for one free whole month, use the code down below. Imagine what you could learn in a whole month. Click the link below. What do you think of the Glen Moray de la Santa? Great whiskey. Just wish it was 46% like the Nectar d'Or, but great sherry cask style of whiskey. Okay, so the next question is, why do whiskey snobs discount blended whiskies so much versus single malts? Couple answers to this. I think firstly, most blended whiskies are not actually targeted at whiskey snobs. They're targeted for the mass market to the most amount of people as possible. What happens when you target the mass market is you kind of dilute your product. You make it really tame, non-offensive, and I think a lot of whiskey geeks and that sort of thing, they're looking for those more challenging whiskies, and a lot of blended whiskies, that's actually not their sales pitch. But that doesn't mean blended whiskies are actually worse than single malts. Compass Box has really shown this because, you know, it makes sense, right? Like if you have someone taking the ingredients from a bunch of distilleries, like surely when they mix it together, they can come up with a whiskey that's better than the sum of its parts, almost like a cooking recipe. And it is. Compass Box is fantastic. But I think the majority of blended whiskey, especially the like cheaper options, it's kind of why single malt has the stereotype that it's kind of a more complex style of whiskey. Okay, so this question came from Brendan on Instagram. He said, do you have a stance on corporate owned distilleries versus like indie? Not really. I think, you know, a good example of this is like the Bourbon 12, which is owned by Distill, and Glenfarclas, which is a family-owned distillery. It's, you know, it's got a great sort of romantic history, but I prefer the Bourbon 12 over the Glenfarclas 12. If you're owned by a big company and you still release great whiskey, that's great. As long as you make great whiskey, I don't really care. Just make great whiskey. Okay, so next question is, what would you choose? 3 hours low-end whiskey in great company, or 1 hour with a high-end whiskey alone? I definitely choose a low-end whiskey and have great company, because I just think whiskey's better enjoyed with other people. Like when you're drinking whiskey and you're chatting and like you try this and they get these notes and you're like, oh yeah, I get those notes too. Like it's just a fun environment that you can't get by yourself. So I think whiskey's always better sharing and enjoying with them. Okay, so this person said, with bottle prices continuing to climb, what is an affordable way, an approach to exploring whiskey? I think an affordable way is to follow the OSWAs, the Online Scotch Whisky Awards. They have a whole category about best value whiskey, being voted in by whiskey geeks all around the world, by people who run whiskey blogs, whiskey channels, and they've done all the hard work. They've tried thousands and thousands of whiskeys and they get it down to 6. If you just want to get a good value whiskey without making a mistake, I think that would be a good place to start. Okay, so the next question is alternatives to Springbank. So Springbank is like an absolute holy grail whiskey for whiskey geeks, but it's just so hard to find these days. So people are looking for alternatives with this kind of flavor profile. And a lot of people say the Springbank of Speyside is the Benromic distillery. And I would agree, like, it has some really similar notes, those industrial notes, those funky notes. Generally, it's bottled a little bit lower strength than the Springbank, so 43 compared to 46, but you're much more likely to be able to find one of these than one of these. Fu from Patreon said, have you ever tasted any Indonesian made whiskey? No, but I'd love to. Whiskey Beer Andrew said, any distillery you'd like to try bottling from but haven't had the chance yet to try. Is there a world whiskey you'd suggest to try and get hold of? Any plans to visit Scotland? No plans to visit Scotland. Got another baby on the way, so no plans at the moment. In terms of a bottling, Ben Nevis. I haven't owned a bottle of Ben Nevis yet. I'd like to. It's a world whiskey. I think everyone should try the Cotswolds. Fantastic English whiskey. So Marco said, what do you think of Kilchoman Distillery? What's your favourite? Definitely Kilchoman Lochgorm. Love this. Sherried, it's smoky, fantastic mix. Bill from Patreon said, do you believe in terroir for whiskey? What is your own best value whiskey? What is your most expensive whiskey? In terms of terroir, yes and no. I don't think it's like wine where you make your whiskey is going to be like completely different than like the paddock over there because of the soil and that sort of thing. I do think though the barley type can make a difference. I do think when you're putting your cask, maybe not in terms of like distilleries like next to each other, but country to country, you can get quite a different result because of how fast the cask breathes and that sort of thing. So like a cold country in like Scotland will be very different to a hot country like India. Best value whiskey, I think, Aaron Coulter cask. And what's the most expensive? Probably the Glen Moray Signet. So I got a question from Dave Swift. another Kiwi. He said, are you worried about your favorite distilleries that will soon be out of reach with prices continuing to rise? Yes, I am worried about the Port Charlotte 10. It's my go-to. I've always got a bottle of it, and it is creeping up in price. And the other thing I'm worried about is the 18-year-olds, like older age statement whiskies. They seem to be rising faster than just your normal age statement whiskies. So yeah, it's definitely worrying. So if there's any questions you feel like I didn't get to that you really want me to answer, leave a comment down below in the description. And yeah, thanks for being here. Thanks, patrons. Thank you for all your questions on Instagram and that sort of thing. Beauty.